What do you call it when the President of the United States doesn't negotiate, doesn't blink, but detonates a 50% tariff across all of Europe? And what do you call it when Europe doesn't argue, but strikes back, torching a $43 billion Boeing deal, rerouting trade lines through Canada, and setting off a global chain reaction that could shift $2 trillion in commerce? You don't call it a trade dispute. You call it what it is, a rupture. A controlled demolition of the transatlantic bond, one that had held for 3/4 of a century. Now it's unraveling, fast, quiet, and possibly forever. Washington thumps its chest, rants about leverage, fixates on steel and peanut butter. But while America shouts, Europe is already gone. Brussels is striking new pacts, shaking hands with Beijing, drawing up a new global trade map, and the U.S. isn't on it. This isn't a warning. It's not a shot across the bow. It's the exit. And by the time the U.S. looks up from its podium, it may find itself standing alone. The first shockwave, $43 billion, gone. The biggest Boeing export deal in modern history, frozen. EU-US trade is no longer strained, it's snapping. Markets are reeling, currencies twitching. And the real question isn't whether a trade war has begun. It's whether the Transatlantic Alliance, NATO's economic twin, has just collapsed under the weight of a single executive order. May 30th, President Trump steps to the podium and declares talks with Europe dead. Effective June 1st, a 50% blanket tariff on all EU imports. All of it, steel, aluminum, cars, electronics, wine, dairy, pharmaceuticals. Washington calls it leverage. Markets call it chaos. European stocks drop 2.1% overnight. Boeing, already stumbling, teeters on the edge. Bloomberg calculates the damage, over $2 trillion in potential trade loss over the next 10 years, if Europe fires back. And Europe does, with speed and precision. Brussels doesn't threaten, it moves. A $95 billion retaliation package is set in motion. And quietly, with almost clinical coldness, the European Commission halts the Boeing aircraft deal. Reuters confirms it. Ryanair's $30 billion order of 737 MAX jets is under review. Their CEO says it plainly, costs are spiraling. Boeing's pricing model is unsustainable. The fallout is immediate. Airbus gains 3.4% on the Frankfurt Exchange. And somewhere deep in a once-dismissed spreadsheet, China's COMAC suddenly moves from fantasy to feasibility. The unthinkable is now being modeled. European airlines flying Chinese jets. Not as a bluff, but as a plan. Boeing is just the beginning. The U.S. aerospace sector, down 6.2% already this year, is facing not a dip, but a fracture. A slow-motion decoupling. Not just supply chains. Entire industries reoriented. Because this wasn't a temper tantrum. It was a dress rehearsal. A simulation of what life without American exports, without American infrastructure might look like. Europe didn't just retaliate. It imagined a future without the United States. And found that it might be possible. And when the EU hits back with tariffs on American staples, Harleys, Levi's, peanut butter, it's not symbolic. It's surgical. It's an attack on the heart of the political map. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan. Harley-Davidson's EU exports tank 30% in 12 months. The company projects $145 million in lost revenue before the next fiscal year even ends. But agriculture? Agriculture bleeds. USDA reports a $23.2 billion collapse in American farm exports to the EU. Land O'Lakes, Wisconsin's pride, announces operational strain as butter and cheese tariffs bite deep. The Midwest, once the engine room of American trade, is being quietly gutted. And all the while, the rhetoric in Washington stays the same. Tariffs will protect us. But the numbers scream the opposite. The U.S. trade deficit hits a historic $140.5 billion in early 2025. Tariffs weren't shields. They were blindfolds. They didn't restore. They exposed. But the deepest cut isn't economic. It's geopolitical. As Washington burns every bridge in sight, Ottawa builds one. Canada doesn't just smile politely, it acts. Under CETA, Europe and Canada eliminate 98% of tariffs. What forms is more than a partnership, it's a corridor. Smooth, modern, frictionless. The European Commission projects $90 billion in annual trade by 2026. Siemens and Alstom begin shifting procurement lines from Georgia and Indiana to Quebec and Ontario. According to Financial Times, EU-Canada clean tech trade spikes 41% year over year. A $1.2 billion hydrogen pact signed at the EU-Canada summit becomes the flagship for a new model. Open markets, environmental standards, digital alignment, all without a single handshake from Washington. Chrystia Freeland, once Canada's trade minister, says it out loud. What began as a trade agreement has become a strategic alliance. The subtext is deafening. Europe no longer sees Canada as America's polite neighbor. It sees it as America's replacement. This isn't a flare-up, it's an eclipse. In just 10 weeks, the transatlantic trade architecture has been hit by wave after wave. 10% here, 20% there, now 50% across the board. WTO complaints pile up. Mega deals collapse. The EU suspends but doesn't cancel a $21 billion retaliation package, waiting, watching with a July 15th trigger date. What happens after that? The answer may already be written. Because what's unfolding isn't just policy, it's history. And when historians look back, they won't ask how it happened. They'll ask, how did America not see it happening? Trump's tariff barrage may have started the fire, but what's spreading now is far beyond retaliation. It's realignment. While Washington prepares a second strike list targeting $95 billion in U.S. exports, still dangling talks as a distant maybe, the clock is already ticking. According to CNBC, White House officials insist Trump's posts aren't official policy yet. But in Brussels, there's no waiting for confirmation. European Commission spokesperson Olaf Gill made it explicit. We are finalizing countermeasures that will take effect on July 14th or earlier. Translation. Time isn't just tight. It's vanishing. Beneath the tariff tit-for-tat is something deeper. Washington is escalating, but Brussels isn't just responding. It's repositioning. The EU isn't playing catch-up. It's rewriting the playbook. As the US leans harder on trade pressure, Europe has quietly turned its focus inward and eastward, accelerating clean tech investments and expanding trade infrastructure far from the Transatlantic axis. The Financial Times reports EU-Canada clean energy projects surged 41% in 2024. With $1.2 billion earmarked for hydrogen and battery initiatives. A joint summit between Brussels and Vancouver inked strategic deals spanning solar standardization, rare earth supply chains, and AI-powered grid infrastructure. Under the Repower EU initiative, Europe has committed to producing 20 million tons of renewable hydrogen annually by 2030, enough to shave $60 billion off fossil fuel imports. But the numbers only hint at the real strategy: insulation. Europe is building buffers, not just against climate shocks or energy shortages, but against US policy whiplash. New power circuits are being wired not through Washington or Beijing, but through self-funded cross-Atlantic networks, grounded in mutual standards and long-term certainty. And now the shift is taking to the skies. Ryanair, the EU's largest low-cost airline, might exit its $30 billion contract with Boeing. Once unthinkable, now plausible. Bloomberg reports Ryanair executives are in quiet talks with China's COMAC, citing delayed deliveries and tariff-driven cost hikes on the 737 MAX, up to 14%. CEO Michael O'Leary warned publicly, unless Boeing restores cost stability, all procurement options are on the table. A switch to COMAC wouldn't just dent Boeing, it would crown China as a credible player in a once US-dominated industry, cracking open FAA regulatory dominance and fracturing global aviation compliance. Airbus might pick up the slack, but a COMAC breakthrough in Europe's low-cost segment would be something else entirely. A signal that aircraft certification, once monopolized by the West, is becoming multipolar. This isn't just about market share, it's about who writes the next chapter in aviation. That shift mirrors what's happening on the ground. CETA, the EU-Canada trade agreement, wasn't just a deal. It was a test. And it worked. Now Brussels is scaling it across the globe. Since 2023, EU negotiators have opened 17 new bilateral talks, many modeled on CETA's zero-tariff, labor-aligned structure. Quietly but deliberately, the EU has tied digital infrastructure funding to trade terms, offering joint investments in AI, semiconductors, and fiber optic expansion in Kenya, India, and the UAE. While Washington obsessed over tariffs, Brussels signed a $3.4 billion supply chain deal with India, easing away from the US dollar in energy settlements. Analysts at the Wall Street Journal point to a fundamental shift. Europe's trade posture is no longer reactionary, it's strategic. CETA was the prototype. The rest is scaling, spreading, solidifying. And the countries moving into America's blind spot? They're not waiting for permission. So when Trump dismissed the EU as a negotiating afterthought and imposed 50% tariffs, Europe didn't flinch. It pivoted. The European Commission is preparing its own $95 billion retaliation, but the deeper wound may already be open. Bloomberg Economics projects U.S. EU trade could shrink by $2 trillion over the next decade if barriers persist. This isn't turbulence, it's a tectonic shift. Airbus shares spiked 3.7% in Frankfurt following the Boeing freeze. Canadian steel exports to Europe jumped 24% in Q1 2025. CETA's success is emboldening Brussels to fast-track 7 new trade compacts, none involving the U.S. Former EU Commissioner Cecilia Malmstrom put it plainly at a panel last month. Decoupling isn't a threat, it's a plan. Washington thought tariffs would force compromise. Instead, Europe built alternatives, new suppliers, new routes, new rules. And now, as Brussels inks deals that span hydrogen, AI, chips, and aviation, with America on the outside looking in, the silence from Washington isn't strategic. It's irrelevant. So ask yourself, what happens if Boeing loses Europe? If COMAC earns credibility? If the U.S. gets locked out of tomorrow's trade pacts and energy deals? This isn't a geopolitical tantrum. It's a controlled exit. Europe is unplugging. One contract, one tariff, one realigned partnership at a time. And while Washington replays the same script it's used for 3 decades, Brussels is quietly writing a new one. One that doesn't need American approval. If this $2 trillion fracture is the wake-up call, then what comes next is the rewrite of the global